According to some experts, it is still unclear whether Ukraine will win, but certainly Russia's goals in the current special military operation are almost hopeless to achieve. For example, complete control of all 4 provinces newly annexed, demilitarized, de-fascist, and de-NATO Ukraine. On every measure of national power, Russia's position is lower than it was before the war. This also changes the status of global powers. Since the Ukraine conflict began, the United States and NATO have become more connected. China becomes Russia's top partner and benefits a lot. The European Union has done better than anticipated, but it could still be the loser, given the negative consequences of the war. The EU may sooner or later overcome this goal, but will be severely challenged if there are conflicts and other collisions. Most Americans think of the EU as a free trade area, but there is a lot of frills. Formed after World War II, the institutions that later constituted the EU were designed to bind the continent so tightly that it was unthinkable that there would be other wars between Europeans. In this regard, the EU model has indeed been very successful, helping to bring about the longest period of peace in Europe in many centuries. Many experts believe that Europeans have made the mistake of thinking that everyone shares the same world view as them. Russia, the Middle East, or China never believed that peace could be maintained for long. Politicians in Eastern Europe who warned Western Europe about potential conflict were arrogantly ignored. From February 2022, war in Eastern Europe occurred, revealing the weakness of the European defense system. Although Europe has made significant military and humanitarian contributions to Ukraine, such as German tanks, Polish and Slovak warplanes, the United States has remained the main organizer and coordinator of the response to the conflict. Russian offensive providing intelligence and supporting Kiev, Washington acts so comprehensively with Ukraine, partly by luck. If Donald Trump remained in office when Russia attacked Ukraine, the U.S. president could go directly to Moscow instead of Kiev. Even with President Joe Biden sitting in the White House, the United States might not have reacted so strongly. If the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan had not turned out to be a disaster, many scholars assert that Ukraine is not an official ally. The U.S. intervention comes more from its own interests. At some point, the United States may see war as a European problem. Mr. Trump did not rule out the possibility of being the next president. Even if he loses, the American First ideology he promotes among American voters will influence U.S. policy no matter who wins in 2024. There is no guarantee that the United States will support Ukraine in the future. Even if the United States remains supportive, China may one day reunify Taiwan by force, leaving the United States without the resources to assist Europe in a lasting crisis. The Pentagon has officially abandoned the goal of being able to wage 2 wars at the same time. Next time conflict comes, Europe may have to fend for itself. For that reason, politicians such as French President Emmanuel Macron have warned, the EU must get serious about self-defense. The EU is an alliance of sovereign states that in theory often pursue a common foreign and defense policy but have different perceptions of Russia. As a result, the EU still lacks defense capabilities and a common approach to security. As long as it is, the EU remains an invisible power, equal to the United States and China in regulating trade, standards and investment, but a dwarf when it comes to defense and security. After the Cold War ended, many people thought that Europe's period of prosperity began, but it took more than 100,000 deaths, most of them Bosnians, during the conflict in Yugoslavia, and with the belated intervention of the United States, the fighting ended temporarily in 1995. The role of the EU was completely bland. Although troops serving under the EU flag were deployed in dozens of countries, most conduct only low-intensity operations. Perhaps the EU's most successful air raid against Mali pirates in 2012. Many EU peacekeepers in Africa, such as in the Central African Republic or Mali, are regularly criticized for their fighting spirit. Although equipped with modern equipment, they always flee when faced with radical Muslim groups. Mali's government in 2022 and 2023 repeatedly urged these soldiers, mainly of French and German nationality, to withdraw. The EU strategy once wanted to form small but flexible combat groups, about 1,500 troops. These groups can be deployed to hotspots in short order. The trouble is that many countries don't want to send troops to contribute. The main groups are still big country soldiers like France and Germany. Thus, an ununified decision cannot be reached, even in emergencies like the 2011 crisis in Libya. The EU first such combat group, which began operating in 2007, has not yet been deployed beyond its borders. The concept seems to have gone into hibernation. Another attempt to seriously discuss European security is the Permanent Structured Cooperation Mechanism, PESCO. In 2009, Poland and France proposed the creation of a vanguard group of states ready to act, when the rest of the EU failed to do so. The group welcomes countries that spend 2% of GDP on defense, agree to common rules, and deploy troops under common command. European history is full of examples of groups of nations pioneering, followed by other nations. Examples are the Common Travel Area known as Schengen, the EU Prosecutor's Office, and the Common Currency. This is supposed to be the way Europe developed and integrated. But PESCO is not an initiative that receives as much support. Under pressure from Germany, PESCO must include most of the EU countries. This is not possible, as many small Europe countries consider themselves militarily neutral, do not want to increase spending, just want to rely on the big countries for protection. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the EU adopted a national defense strategy aimed at increasing the mobility of the armed forces, facilitating exercise on land and at sea. More importantly, the EU established a rapid response force of about 5,000 troops. This initiative promises a leap forward in the formation of an European security architecture, gradually reducing dependence on the US and NATO. A fund with an amount of $1 billion per year was also born, based on the European Peace Fund, originally conceived as a mechanism to pay the common cost of the EU activities, mainly in Africa and Balkan, which has gradually evolved into a foreign military financing program equivalent to a U.S. fund, which specializes in financing the purchase and repair of weapons sent to Ukraine, as well as assistance to Nigeria, Jordan, North Macedonia, among other countries. Many people believe that NATO is still the main mechanism to coordinate the activities of the West with the war in Ukraine. Biden's strong response has restored the credibility of the coalition that French President Emmanuel Macron not long ago deemed brain dead. Washington's courageous use of intelligence to inform Ukrainians of an impending Russian attack has partially erased the stain of misinformation abuse that underlied the 2003 Iraq War. The war in Ukraine has also brought the United States and the EU closer together. According to the Kiel Institution for World Economy, U.S. contributions to Ukraine to date totaling more than $70 billion, about the same as EU contributions. But what matters is that unification, how long will it last, and what if Europe is less fortunate in the near term? Unlike the United States, which is fairly well protected from external threats, the European Union has several vulnerable areas. For example, the Narva region of Estonia, on the other side is the Russian town of Ivangorod. This region was founded by the Russian Emperor Ivan. Narva changed hands dozens of times. Denmark, Tsarist Russia, Sweden, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Many fear that Russia, never content with losing Estonia in 1991, may want to bring it back again, which is why Estonia makes the largest per capita contribution to Ukraine in NATO. The residents of Lisbon, Rome, and Brussels, by contrast, had never seen a Russian soldier in the city uninvited, and neither did their ancestors. Therefore, most people in Portugal, Italy, and Belgium support efforts to prevent Russia from violating post-war taboos, but hope that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine can be resolved through compromise. In Germany, however, the story is different. The Russians arrived in Berlin as a victorious army in 1945 and ruled a quarter of Germany until 1991. The Germans remained friendly and refused to see Russia as a threat until 2022, perhaps because of gratitude to Russia for their help a peaceful reunification in 1990. German public attitudes toward Russia changed as the war broke out. But even after Chancellor Olaf Scholz delivered a historic speech highlighting the change in Berlin's defense posture, it took many months for German politics to accept that a return to the old relationship with President Putin would not be possible. Some Germans still hope it is possible. If Europe's most powerful country is ambivalent about defense, then the structure of the EU and the lack of a common constitution also hinder the continent from moving towards a collective security mechanism. The EU is a union, not a federation. Members are bound by treaties and joint decisions, but power belongs to each country by consensus. If a country fails to fulfill its obligations to the bloc, that country can be criticized, have its funding suspended, or even taken to the European Court of Justice. But there is no rule forcing them to do whatever. This aspect also affects the intelligence, internal security, and defense sectors. In theory, the EU has a common foreign and security policy. Article 26 of the Treaty on the European Union, signed in Lisbon in 2007, stipulates the Council of Europe should determine the strategic interests of the Union, define objectives, guide foreign policy and security, including defense-related matters. The common foreign and security policy would be implemented by high-level representatives and member states using the resources of each country and the Union. Despite the terms of association, in reality, the role of key members in the EU is often more important than the Union. When President Macron and European Commission President von der Leyen both visited China in April 2023, the French leader received a state reception and military parade, while the European Commission President received a less cordial welcome. According to experts, Russia is now very difficult to win militarily in Ukraine if NATO still provides aid. Western sanctions could prevent Russia from building a new army capable of threatening Europe for another half a decade. But even that outcome would not protect Europe from its worst nightmare, a conflict between the United States and China on a small scale, also damaging the US, forcing Europe to self-defense on many fronts. Recent developments show that the EU is almost unable to control its relationship with China. Europe is a great power that wants to keep international law as it is, while China is a revisionist country that wants to change the old international order and create a new one of its own. Europe is aligning with the United States in responding to challenges from China, for example, preventing it from possessing sensitive technology and coordinating against Beijing's economic intelligence campaigns. But for the EU to fend for itself, freeing American forces to Asia for a potential conflict, the bloc has to make tough decisions about making serious investments in defense. It took a decade for new weapon system, from concept to contract to production to use. If China is preparing to reunify Taiwan by military forces by the end of this decade, as some analysts predict, Europe is one step behind. The scenario that causes headaches for Europeans is a conflict that forces the EU to choose between its largest trading partner and most powerful ally. President Macron was criticized in April 2023 when he said that Europe faced great danger of being caught up in crisis, not of its own making. This prevents Europe from building strategic autonomy. However, he only said aloud what many Europeans had long whispered. A war between the United States and China, for example over Taiwan or some maritime dispute in Asia, would be catastrophic for Europe. According to Santander Bank, the damage from the Ukraine war to the European economy in 2022 is about $190 billion or 1.3% of GDP. Russia is the relatively small economy on which Europe depends, mainly in the oil and gas sectors, but the sudden replacement of supply has slowed growth, caused high inflation and slowed Europe's post-pandemic recovery. Sudden decoupling from China's economy would cost many times more, since Europe is more dependent on China than it is on Russia. China is not only the largest market for EU exports, but also where the EU needs many important goods such as rare earths, precious minerals, electronics, or consumer goods. French President Macron has correctly expressed Europe's anxiety, but according to experts, he is wrong to think that Europe can stay out of the US-China conflict. It is true that the EU has no legal obligation to assist the United States in such a scenario, but no matter who is president, the United States won't do anything in the face of a great challenge. The US will ask the EU, "Are you with us or with our enemies?" Faced with such a choice, can Europe really stand on the sidelines? When Europeans continue to trade with China, when American soldiers die to protect friendly countries in Asia. According to experts, Europe is only suitable in terms of strategic alliance, as well as deeper integration when linking with the United States in a self-defense position. The French president's vision of a united Europe should be considered. Experts also said that a conflict between the United States and China is inevitable, and Europe should do its best to prevent it. China has reached its demographic tipping point, possibly falling into a debt crisis, as analysts predicted years ago. China could also withdraw its support for Russia, as it did when it joined hands with the US during the Cold War, causing the Soviet Union to disintegrate. Looking closely at President Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow in March 2023, it can be seen that the Russia-China alliance is not as strong as many people imagine. China's conflict with the West is increasingly acute, but China also has its own problems, and there is still room for negotiation. The decision to attack Ukraine has shown that Russia is much weaker than previously assessed. This is also pushing Moscow towards Beijing's orbit. China is buying oil, gas, and raw materials from Russia cheaply. If it continues, China could buy Russia's gold reserves and then make territorial claims. Some Russian experts could not help but be pessimistic when saying that the war in Ukraine, instead of being able to help Russia bring Kiev back, put Russia at risk of losing the port city of Vladivostok in the fight. Recently, in weather forecasting programs, China began to call some regions of Russia by their old Chinese names, not transliterate from Russian or English. The Russian government also decided to allow the port of Vladivostok to be a transit place for Chinese import and export to the world. Former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, "Russia can choose to become an ally with the West or depend on China." Many patriotic Russians have foreseen the disaster of being too dependent on their giant neighbor. According to experts, both scenarios, where Russia is more dependent on China and the US-China confrontation worsens, are detrimental to Europe. If the US-China conflict in Asia, Europe would not only find it difficult to choose sides, the economy won't be turned upside down, but the eastern flank bordering Russia also has many potential risks. Not ruling out the possibility, Russia wants to recover the old lands just like what Estonia is afraid of. If a US-China conflict occurs, it is highly likely that China will push Russia to do so, to divide the fire and cause the disintegration of Europe. This has a high probability of becoming a reality if then Russia is still heavily dependent on Beijing. According to experts, the EU needs to build its own defense economic strength now to be ready for a potential US-China conflict in the future. In addition, to reduce the possible tragedy related to China, in the long term, the EU should rebalance its relationship with Russia in order to stabilize the eastern flank. This also has wrapped up our program today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.